Hello there, I'm Brian Taylor. Big welcome to my latest Herald podcast. Bring in the army. That's one response as Scotland's ambulance services are struggling to cope with the pandemic problems while folk are waiting hours. And today the Herald spotlighted a tragic case where a patient died while waiting. And waiting, it all added up to extremely tough questions indeed for the First Minister at Holyrood. We'll mull over those issues now with three senior MSPs, Clare Adamson from the SNP, Oliver Mundell from the Conservatives, and Paul Sweeney from Labour. Delighted to welcome all three. But first, let's hear from my Herald colleague, Alistair Grant. Alistair, remind us of that, first of all, that Herald story and the issue that it exemplifies that was raised with the First Minister.
Yeah, so as you say, there's a story on the front page of the Herald today, written by my colleague Helen McArdle, the Herald's health correspondent, about 65-year-old Gerard Brown from Glasgow, who died following a 40-hour wait for an ambulance after being found collapsed at his home. And his family were told by Mr. Brown's GP that the delay essentially cost Mr. Brown his life. The GP branded the crisis facing the ambulance service third world medicine. Probably worth saying there's an investigation into this underway at the moment as well. Yes. And just to highlight, there's a similar story in the front page of today's Daily Record with Lillian Briggs, 86-year-old, who I think waited almost 8 hours for an ambulance while in a great deal of pain. As you say as well, it was raised by both Douglas Ross, the Scottish Tory leader, and Anna Sarwar, Scottish Labour leader, at FMQs today. And Nicola Sturgeon very clear that the circumstances were unacceptable. And as you touched on as well, saying the Scottish Government is looking at requesting what she called targeted military assistance for the ambulance service. And I think it's worth saying as well, it was one of those FMQs where when Douglas Ross first brought it up, there's just absolute silence in the chamber, just that kind of feeling of a very, very heavy atmosphere. And I think just looking at Humza Yousaf, the Health Secretary's body language, I think it was quite uncomfortable for him and for the government as well. And it's also worth saying that it comes after Humza Yousaf said that people should think twice about phoning an ambulance, phoning 999, just because of the pressures, the acute pressures the ambulance service is under at the moment.
Alistair, thanks very much. We'll come back to you in a moment. As you say, a very sombre session of questions to the First Minister. I think Alex Cole-Hamilton for the Liberal Democrats raised the topic as well. We'll talk about the Humza Yousaf thing in a minute, but let's talk about those figures, the situation generally. Clare Adamson, first of all, this was difficult for the First Minister, to say the least, and she didn't make any attempt to say that the situation was anything other than challenging and required to be remedied.
No, I think that's absolutely right to do so, and my condolences to the Brown family and the other people who have been affected by this. It's absolutely right that the First Minister apologised for what had happened and absolutely emphasised that this is not acceptable, and we'll have to wait the outcome of the investigations that are going on to these particular incidents that were highlighted today. I think it does re-emphasise to us, though, that COVID has not gone away, that the challenges and pressures on our health centre, on our health services are at really, really high level. And as someone who attended an NHS briefing on the 3rd of September and listened to NHS Lanarkshire then talking about how difficult it was, and I was facing my constituents not having elective surgery or not being able to get anything other than emergency social care. The virus is still here, and that's why we need to do everything in our arsenal to try and keep this under control, encourage vaccination, and continue to be as thoughtful about our daily lives as possible and the pressures and the impacts of what we do have on other people.
Paul Sweeney, is it down? I mean, the virus will not be helping, but Anna Sarwar suggested in the chamber that there were pre-existing problems. Paul Sweeney. Paul, you hearing me?
I've got a message through. Sorry, Brian, to jump in that Paul can't hear.
Please carry on. Yeah, do carry on. Yeah, please. Okay, Paul Sweeney, you hearing me now? Paul's not hearing. Let's go to Oliver Mundell from the Conservatives. What do you make of what you heard from the First Minister and what you've just heard from Clare Adamson? I mean, is there a pre-existing problem that's adding to the difficulties?
There's been problems in the Scottish Ambulance Service for years, and obviously no one's denying that COVID is adding to those pressures. But there's been warning signs for months. I've had a GP in my own constituency in touch saying that he struggled to get an ambulance for a patient, a case Douglas Ross referenced last week. And I think the First Minister kind of tiptoed round an apology. She tiptoed round the kind of the wording, trying to deny there was a crisis. But I think the whole service is at breaking point, and it shouldn't have taken a week to be looking at bringing in the UK Armed Forces. We should have been looking for those solutions last week.
But she didn't. She apologised, I thought, truly and frankly, about the
individual cases, but she wasn't really willing to recognise that we are at crisis point.
Well,
and I think she talked about what language she didn't want to use. But I think that the most straightforward thing when we see stories like we saw in the Herald this morning, is to admit we have hit crisis point. Bringing in the UK Armed Forces to help back up the ambulance service, is what most reasonable people would recognise as a crisis. And we've got to get this problem sorted quickly, or more lives are going to be lost.
Clare Adamson, you were keen to get back in.
I think the Conservatives have to be really careful about their attitude to this, because they're facing both ways on this. On one hand, they're saying the NHS is at crisis and services are at an extremely difficult level. They are, but at the same time, they are trying to act and press as if COVID is going away. The motion this week about GP services and an arbitrary date to return to what they were saying was normal face-to-face practices, when the NHS and GP surgeries have been working flat out throughout this crisis with measures there intended to protect the public and limit the spread of this disease. Now, not a single Tory attended the briefing from the NHS Lanarkshire 3 weeks ago, and in that we were shown graphs of how in the third wave, fewer people are dying from the virus, and it's much lower than before because of vaccines. So what did the Scottish Government do under these pressures? They introduced the vaccine passport designed to limit the spread of the disease yet again, and the Tories vote against it. And then they're now saying
we'll come to that in a second.
More. But they can't face both ways up there. They should get behind the measures that the Scottish Government is taking to control the virus and ease that pressure on our health service instead of adding to it.
We'll talk about passports in a moment, but let's stick to the I understand that they're interconnected. We will definitely come to that. Oliver Mundell, the Nicola Sturgeon said she didn't want to trade language, didn't want to trade talks about language. She would rather sort the problem than discuss what the terminology was.
And I would be willing to accept that, Brian, if there have been signs that Nicola Sturgeon and the Health Secretary have been trying to solve the problems. This issue was raised a week ago. And today, in the course of FMQs, we heard in her first answer to Douglas Ross that she was considering asking the UK Armed Forces for help. By the time we got to Anas Sarwar, it seemed a bit more definite. And by the time she got to Alex Cole-Hamilton, she was away to make the request straight after the session. It just seems on this issue and on so many issues, the Scottish Government are reactive. We're 18 months into the pandemic. We knew these issues were building. And they've acted, in my view, too slowly. They're not listening to the unions. They're not listening to frontline staff. They're not listening to opposition politicians. I think we need to get real and accept we are at crisis point, and that requires a different type of response. And that language, I think, does up the urgency to get things sorted in these pressures in the system. And I'd say to Clare Adamson, I'd be more willing to accept. The type of argument she was trying to make, if the Scottish Government got the test and protect service working efficiently, because alongside vaccination, the most important thing we can do to suppress the virus and keep numbers down is take positive cases out of circulation. And some of these measures that she talks about wouldn't be necessary or even being considered if that was working well.
Thanks for that. Let Clare answer that, and then we'll try and bring Paul in. Clare, please carry on.
That was not the message that I took from the NHS Lanarkshire briefing. It was the vaccine effect. We have to encourage more people to take the vaccine. And we know that the people that are now presenting in hospital are a different demographic from the first and second wave. And we have to do everything we can to encourage people to have the vaccine.
Yeah, I agree. We have to encourage them. We have to encourage them to have the vaccine, but not force them. I don't think anyone should be forced. We should be making a reasoned case to young people, and I would urge anyone listening to this, if you've not been vaccinated, go and get it done. It makes a big difference to your health and the health of others.
Let's try and bring in Paul Sweeney. He's been very patient. I hope the technological problems have been overcome. Paul, what do you make of this controversy over the ambulance service? Anna Sarwar suggesting that there was a problem that was exacerbated by COVID, not created by COVID.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's been a threadbare infrastructure that when the COVID pandemic hit, it's overwhelmed the system, and that's further exacerbated the problems. Certainly, I've had constituents coming to me in the last few days expressing their deep concerns. Indeed, there was one case of a constituent, Brian Snedden, who suffered a stroke on Tuesday last week, and he ended up actually waiting over 4 hours for an ambulance. By the time he got to the hospital, the doctors ended up having to tell his son that, in fact, the stroke treatment that could have actually really improved his condition wasn't administrable after that 4-hour window. So therefore, he's going to face a lifelong disability as a result. And that's tragic, absolutely outrageous to think that, people sit there at home thinking if the worst came to it, if I call an ambulance, I'm going to get someone coming urgently to help me if a life-threatening situation ever were to strike my family. And the horror of realizing that that's not going to happen is really a rude awakening for a lot of people. And we really need to
presumably you accept that we are dealing with a global pandemic that has killed millions around the world. These are not usual circumstances. These are, as the First Minister described them, exceptional circumstances. Paul Sweeney. Oh, we've lost Paul again. Oliver Mundell, try that question on you. I mean, these are exceptional.
Of course, yes, but the issue is it's all relative, isn't it? If your infrastructure isn't up to scratch.
Talk about infrastructure not being up to scratch. It seems we're having difficulty with infrastructure. Clare Adamson, let me come to you. Is the accusation made by Labour's Anna Sarwar was that the First Minister had been in denial over this issue, had been denying the extent of the challenge facing the ambulance system?
No, I don't think that's the case at all. And I do think there has been significant amount of work done with the unions to address some of the immediate concerns regarding the high status, the high alert status that the ambulance service is on. And the First Minister has been working with the service. And I think that's the message from today is let's work together, let's do what we can, get the Army involved if required, work with the ambulance service and try to improve it as much as we can at this state. No one has been sitting back and not paying attention. It's been the foremost interest of the First Minister throughout is how to deal with the COVID situation, how to protect our health service and how to ensure that that they're not overwhelmed in a way that would be worse than we are at the moment. I can't emphasise enough that it's an extremely precarious situation for our health service and we need to do all that we can to improve. So let's work together with the ambulance service and with the Army to put the solutions in place as quickly as possible.
Oliver Mundell, you're keen to come in.
I would just say I'd be willing to accept that some things might slip around the edges, but I think when we're looking at the story that was both in the Herald and the Record today, and a number of examples that come from round the chamber, once you're asking people to wait for hours and hours, having made a 999 call, you do have to accept that something's gone very badly wrong, and I don't feel that we've seen the prioritisation of this issue that people across the country would expect.
Let's try Paul Sweeney again. Paul, are you hearing me now?
Yeah, different device. Let's hope we get luck here with this one.
The comments from Hamza Yusuf, Nicola Sturgeon saying he was misinterpreted, it was misunderstood. But he did seem to be saying people should think twice before going to the emergency option. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's beside the point because calls are handled on a triage basis anyway. So if you're going to be presenting with an issue that doesn't require an ambulance, the operator would determine that anyway. So it's not about people, it's just about not the helpline, the 999 service, rather than actually about ambulance demand. So I think that's beside the point. The issue is actually at A&Es. We're not getting people out of ambulances into the hospital quick enough. So they're queuing up at the A&Es, so it's dragging on the service. That is the main issue, and that's where the capacity problems are lying.
So the ambulances whisk somebody to hospital, but then they sit there for ages and can't answer other calls. Is that right?
Yes, precisely. That's a major factor in the huge inefficiencies we're starting to experience, and it's that flow that's problematic. So it's not necessarily about the ambulances themselves; it's actually the impact they're having when they actually get to the hospital.
So presumably then you would welcome this statement from the First Minister that there's going to be a look at temporary admissions wards in hospitals to try and remedy that problem.
Well, I think it's certainly a factor that we need to address, and that's definitely welcome. But what I think was problematic today was the seeming lack of a sense of urgency, that we were going to wait for another week before we have further measures put in place. That's not good enough. We need a 24-hour sort of turnaround on this. It should be the only thing occupying the First Minister's attention today. I would hope that would be the case.
I didn't hear her say that. I heard her say that there'd be a statement next week from Humza Yousaf, but in the meantime, I think she said that it would be 24 hours a day efforts to try and remedy the situation.
Well, my impression was it was going to be that Parliament would only be informed a week later, and there wasn't going to be the same sort of sense of urgency. That was definitely the response from the Chamber, was that wasn't good enough. Okay. And I think that's definitely a valid concern. And we need to have a much more rigorous approach to reporting on this issue. And we need to have daily updates with what's going on to Parliament.
Alistair Grant, those comments by Humza Yousaf, was he misinterpreted or did he misspeak? Should he have chosen his words more carefully? What's your call on that?
I mean, I think I suppose it's kind of it's almost like a political argument in terms of. I mean, he said what he said, and I think from his point of view, he was mirroring something the Scottish Ambulance Service themselves had said. I think in the past, where making people aware that the situation is acute and only phoning 999 if it's an absolute, it's an emergency, you need to go to A&E. But he did say it, and it seemed quite stark at the time. And I think as well, I mean, comments in the Chamber today from Nicola Sturgeon I thought drove home the seriousness of the issue when she was talking about the winter coming up and it potentially being, the most serious situation in terms of our health service that we've ever seen, certainly in living memory. And I think if these issues exist now, when the weather, is reasonably okay, then it's kind of worrying to look ahead and think about how these issues could get worse if action isn't taken immediately.
Oliver, what did you make of the comments by Humza Yousaf? The Tories seem to be suggesting perhaps he should consider his position. Was it as serious as that?
I think he should consider apologising and stressing that that's not what he meant, because it came across. I mean, I actually heard it live on the radio, and it didn't sound good then. And I think it was quite clear from the First Minister's comments today that she didn't really want to engage with that language. And it's not the first time in this pandemic that the Health Secretary's done a very poor job of communicating with the public or giving out information that wasn't quite as it should have been. And I think there's an important message there. People don't pick up 999 and dial an ambulance for trivial reasons. And as Paul has said, I would suggest anyone who thinks they need an ambulance, they should continue doing that. And the person at the end of the line will do their very best to manage the pressures that are clearly there within the system.
Thanks. Claire, what about the comment of the think twice comment? Could he have expressed it better to put it at the minimum?
I'm not going to speak for Humza in this, but I think the message from the First Minister was absolutely clear. If people feel they need an ambulance, they should dial 999 and they should do it. And I also point people to the ambulance service website itself, which tells you where to get help, what reasons to call 999, and it has a list of possible situations there. And I think what really is the crux of what Humza's comments were about was, is there someone else that you can seek help, whether that's through primary care, through pharmacies, through minor injuries units. If there's another option, then if people can take that, they should. But that does not mean that anyone should not phone 999 if they are in desperate need for that service. It
sounds from the sounds in the background there as if somebody has perhaps dialed 999. We're hearing the blues and twos in the distance. Thanks for that. I'm going to move on to another topic in a second, but I should have said earlier, if you that story that was in the Herald that was then raised in the Chamber with the First Minister, if you want to get all the Herald's coverage, you can subscribe to the Herald and you can use a little device by signing in as Herald Pod 2021, and you get a discount of, I think it's 20%. I think it's a fifth off. Herald Pod 2021. Now, let's move to a topic of COVID passports. Clare Adamson and Oliver were talking a little bit about them earlier. We got evidence this morning from the Scottish Professional Football League and from nightclubs, basically from the Licensed Trade Association. Alistair, bring us up to speed with that. They weren't awfully happy, were they?
They certainly raised issues. Yeah, I mean, just to go back. I mean, obviously, COVID passports were voted through Holyrood last week. It's kind of down party political lines. So the Greens and the SNP voted for them, the Lib Dems, Labour and the Tories voted against. And essentially this will just mean that Scots will have to show their vaccine certification for getting into nightclubs and large events. And it's hugely controversial. It's been controversial among politicians, but it's also controversial among the people who have to be implementing these rules. So we had evidence this morning from, like you say, Scottish Licensed Trade Association and the SPFL. I think one of the things that the SLTA were saying, which I thought was quite interesting, was it's all around this kind of thorny, difficult issue of the definition of a nightclub, which we still don't have, because you can't just use the dictionary definition. It has to be specific in order to be enacted in legislation, essentially. And the SLTA, were saying that essentially using the definition that they were saying the Scottish Government is thinking about at the moment, you're talking about thousands, 2,000 venues around Scotland that would be hit by that. It wouldn't just be the couple of hundred or the 100 or so that self-identify as nightclubs.
Yeah, and they were also talking, weren't they? I mean, both that was Gavin Stevenson and Neil Doncaster from the Scottish Professional Football League saying they ain't got the stewards to do this at big grounds, and there wouldn't be the time, and it could cost thousands to bring in the staff. Thanks, Alistair. But hold those thoughts for a second. Paul Sweeney, what about this? I mean, okay, we hear about the practical problems. They're always teething troubles bringing something in. But if it drives, you were saying earlier, you need to get young people to take the vaccine. If this drives young people to get the vaccine, to get the certificate, isn't it a good idea?
I don't think there's sufficient evidence to demonstrate that this particular measure drives up vaccine uptake. I think what we're doing,
it hasn't been tried yet. So
I think there's evidence around the world that this so far doesn't demonstrate convincingly that it happens. Also, I think we need to look at alternative measures that are less labour intensive and less inefficient. I think what we need to look at is perhaps positive alternatives. For example, why not offer people a small financial incentive to present for vaccination, for example? It'd be very straightforward to add that into the current system. And also,
you get what the ones that have delayed and dithered and not got the vaccine get paid, and the ones that behaved themselves and got 2 vaccines get nothing. Oh, that's really going to.
I don't think it's a case of dithering. I think it's a case of young people who are being last in the cohorts to come forward need a bit more positive encouragement. And indeed, you used to get a free pint of Guinness for donating a pint of blood. So I don't know why you can't get a slight incentive to turn up to take up the vaccine. I think that might be something much more worthwhile instead of pushing even more administrative burdens onto businesses that are already very fragile and suffer significant costs. And as well as a state with limited bandwidth in terms of managing existing pressures on test and protect, which we already know is failing badly. We need to actually reinforce the resources into those systems, testing people, actually, which is more effective at suppressing the virus and making sure people are being regularly tested, and that evidence is there. We know that just being double vaccinated doesn't make you immune from contracting the virus or being symptomatic or passing it on. So I think actually focusing our efforts on testing would increase our likelihood of suppression, and also in terms of driving up vaccines, I think a positive incentive would be more useful than some sort of negative administration of a passport system.
Okay, Clare Adamson, do you think it's a good idea? I mean, your ministers were pretty sceptical before they introduced it. They almost had to convince themselves.
Well, I don't think so. I think it was always reserved as something that would be looked at going forward. And I think in fact, the UK government have taken exactly that stance on it going forward. I think it is necessary. And I think if you look at the demographic...
They've dumped the plan as unworkable.
Well, I don't think it's unworkable. We've seen it applied in many EU countries. It is working, and it is making an impact on controlling the virus. And I think when you look at, we're talking now about people taking part in social events and everything, when we've just been talking about people who can't get elective surgery, who are delayed in health service. We have to look at the demographic of who's attending hospital. And we know it's a lower age group. It's mainly people who haven't been vaccinated. And that's the pressure on the health service right now. And I will do anything I can to ensure that happens. So there's obstacles to be overcome. There's relationships to be built with those who are going to be affected. But and there is a recovery plan that we need to look at for these businesses. But we have supported nightclubs through the culture funding that in a way that they never received support before. And I think, we have to also ask what's going to happen about furlough, because furlough is coming to an end, and many of these organisations have been dependent on that to get through the COVID crisis so far. So there's other issues that need to be addressed too about recovery for this industry.
On practicality, Neil Doncaster from Scottish Professional Football League, he said there needed to be a light touch approach. But interpreting that, translating that, I think he means you're going to have to give us a break here. There isn't going to be a chance of, say there's a 30,000, 40,000 crowd, there isn't going to be a chance of checking all of their documentation, it isn't going to happen. They'll test, maybe random sampling. Do you accept in practice that's what's going to happen, or do you expect everyone going into a nightclub, everyone going into a big football game to be obliged to show these two vaccination documentation?
I think it has to be dependent on the circumstance. So a nightclub, in my mind, is different from a football stadium. And the Health Secretary has said he's going to look at some of these options to see what can go through it. And it's about working together, all of us working together to come up with solutions that help us control this virus.
Oliver Mundell, the UK Conservative government looked very carefully at this and then drew back, but isn't there some merit in something if it encourages people to take up a vaccination? Do you fancy Paul Sweeney's idea of handing out some incentives?
I'm not so keen on that, and certainly I know that many blood donors go along to get their cup of tea and Tunnock's tea cake. They're not there for the Guinness, and I just think there's something in that proposal. It was mentioned in the States. I think they looked at that there. And I think we've got to make a reasoned argument to people of why getting the vaccination is good for them and good for other people. And I actually think the harder you push with some individuals, the more it seems like the government's forcing people to get vaccinated, the less likely they are to do that. And lots of the scientific and behaviour psychology commentary supports that. So I think it's about making it easy for people to get vaccinated, getting mobile vaccination clinics out and about, making it easy for young people to get away from work, away from college, away from other things they might be doing, and really pushing in that way. I think the
numbers are still not, there's still sizable numbers, not huge, but sizable numbers who are not getting vaccinated. They just don't seem to want to do it. Do you not have to have some sort of, stick as well as the carrot? Oliver, then Paul.
Well, I think you've got to make that reasoned argument. I don't think we don't live in a country where we do force people to get vaccinated, and I think we should recognise the fact and look at it as a positive. We've got a very high percentage of the adult population vaccinated, and that's partly why I don't think that the vaccination passports deliver exactly what has been presented. I also think, as you've pointed out in this programme, as we've heard time and time again, there hasn't been a lot of thinking about this. The UK government, when they were considering this idea, did a big consultation exercise. They looked at what people had to say about it. Clare talks about working together, but these industries who are going to be most affected don't feel they had any communication with the government. No one was in touch with them in advance. And what they heard was the same as me, which was the Deputy First Minister responsible for the COVID recovery going on the radio and telling people that this was a bad idea, that it wasn't a route we wanted to go down, and then going away for months and seemingly doing very little, then coming back to Parliament with a 5-page document and asking MSPs to back something which has turned out to be half-baked and full of flaws. I don't think that builds public trust, and I don't think it encourages vaccination.
This is a global pandemic. If you cannot adapt your ideas during a global pandemic, it ain't ever going to happen.
Well, I think you have to be open to ideas and properly work them through so that they don't have unintended consequences. And what the Scottish Government are very keen at doing is giving these sort of categorical positions and then pushing ahead with something different. And it becomes very confusing for businesses, for members of the public. And all the time we've been spending talking about this is time that we haven't been focused on getting Test and Protect working. And as I said earlier, the combination of encouraging people to get vaccinated and taking positive cases out of circulation is the only way to drive down cases. And some of the measures that are being suggested and this particular proposal, I think, will turn out to have counterintuitive consequences.
Oh, really?
I don't think it will deliver the uptick in vaccination that people hope for, and it will.
Hold on, Oliver. Are you saying you think it could make it worse rather than better?
I think it could make it worse because clearly no one's going to get unvaccinated as a result of the vaccine passport.
No, but if it slows down the uptake,
I think there'll be some. I think there'll be some individuals who will end up being more resistant to being vaccinated if they feel they're being forced to do so. And I think the best way to maximise the vaccine uptake, as we've seen right the way through the adult population, as we're now seeing with young people, is to make the positive case to help people understand the benefits, the fact that getting vaccinated reduces the risk of becoming seriously unwell, it reduces the risk of hospitalisation, it allows us all to go back to normal, that the vaccine is very safe, and is being used right around the world, and that people shouldn't put off getting vaccinated. It's the biggest thing they can do to help everyone else.
Oliver, thanks. Paul, then Claire. If we don't do this, or we are doing this, it's happening in Scotland. But if this doesn't necessarily work, what is it? Do we just persuade, cajole? Paul, what do we do? Claire, what do we do? Paul first.
I mean, I started open-minded about this. I didn't come in with a fixed view about what the merits of it were. I listened to the arguments. I listened to the evidence. I wasn't convinced that this was the most effective and efficient means of delivering the outcome we all share, which is to get jags in arms as quickly as possible and to have comprehensive coverage of the population to reach herd immunity. We've successfully broken the link between death and contracting the virus, because the vast majority of deaths have occurred in age groups which are now pretty much entirely vaccinated. The issue is ill health in younger people who are unvaccinated. That's why we need to push that issue. And I'm not convinced that the vaccine passports will be the most effective means of doing it, especially given the finite resources available to the state. We're diverting man hours out of things that need to be focused on, like test and protect, to run another layer of bureaucracy. What we could do is look at other examples. In the 1950s, Glasgow ran a very successful anti-TB X-ray program, and it did it very successfully by offering positive incentives, prizes, various other positive incentives to get chest X-rays to eliminate tuberculosis from Glasgow, which is one of the most effective public health campaigns in Scottish history. So let's actually learn from some of the examples we've done in the past to good effect.
What sort of prizes could you get? I'm intrigued by
these. You want a fridge freezer or something, and various other things. In the council ward, they get the highest rate of X-rays, won special prizes for their local parks and things like that. So there you go. Interesting story.
Claire, are you attracted by the idea of all must win and all must have prizes?
I'm not so sure, and my godmother was actually a nurse at the time that took part in that in Glasgow, but it's a long time ago. If I can maybe make the comparison to the smoking ban in pubs, because what we've not talked about as well is that nightclubs and pubs and these places are places of work. And we need to do as much as we can to protect the people that are working in these environments as well. And I think, at that time that was controversial for all of those reasons, but we wouldn't think to go back to a situation where someone in a nightclub was exposed to smoke in their workplace because it's less safe. And let's just think of the vaccine passports as making these places more safe.
Okay, thanks to all three on that. I'm going to move on to the final topic for the discussion. Thanks for that. We'll just have to see how the vaccine passports work when they're brought in. Intriguing discussion there as well. New stats, Alistair, on the economy. We had the issue of the removal of the £20 temporary uplift to universal credit, but we had some stats on the cost of living and inflation, stats on growth rate in Scotland as well. If you've got those, I'd be grateful.
Yeah, so they were kind of good news in a way. Scottish economy grew by, I think it was 4.7% quarter on quarter in the 3 months to June, and GDP was up by 21.7% on the same period of last year. So it's obviously good news. It's a sign that kind of lockdown has been easing, more kind of shops and businesses have been able to open. The economy is kind of recovering and getting closer back to normal. But I think it was interesting in Finance Secretary Kate Forbes' statement when these figures were released, how kind of cautious it was. She was obviously welcoming it, but also kind of noting that the pandemic is not over and that challenges remain. There's some sectors, I think she mentioned retail, tourism, hospitality, where those obstacles to recovery are still very much there. So although it's good news and although the economy is recovering, I think her message was, it's not over yet. We've got quite a long way to go.
Right, and then we have the inflation figures, cost of living up 3.2% in the year to August, and we have that business of, let's talk about the universal credit first of all. In that wider context, I want to bring in everyone on the wider economic question. Clare Adamson, the £20 uplift to universal credit was always stated that it was temporary. Is it not reasonable in those circumstances, as the pandemic begins, this too will pass, as the pandemic begins to pass, is it not reasonable to remove that, what was meant to be a temporary uplift to the universal credit?
Well, I would say temporary but necessary, and still necessary, because people who are in receipt of this require that money just to make ends meet, and we really can't go back to a situation where universal credit is not meeting people's needs, and it doesn't. We should keep the £20 uplift. People on universal credit, many of whom will be working, are now also going to be faced with the prospect of increased national insurance costs, and it's just the wrong thing to do at this time. And I think that it really is a shame that the calls from the sector support, have been ignored by the Tory government, and we need to do this now. And I'm sorry, but Scotland can't mitigate for every bad decision that's done in Westminster. They need to do the right thing on this.
Paul Sweeney, what do you make of it?
Reliant on universal credit. If I didn't have the £20 uplift over the last year, I'd have lost my flat. So from a personal level, I know how vital this was to me.
Wow.
And luckily, I had the escape route of obviously being elected. But for a lot of people, they are already in work. The vast majority, actually, of people who are on universal credit are either carers or people who have dependents, or there are people who are already in work, but their work doesn't pay them enough to live a dignified quality of life. And indeed, in Glasgow, the effect of the biggest welfare cut in the history of the welfare state overnight, this will cut a huge amount out of the system. This will rip £86 million a year out of Glasgow's economy. That's a huge impact. We're talking about trying to encourage growth in the economy. You know, these are people who aren't going to be saving it in some, Swiss bank account. They're going to be actually living hand to mouth, needing to spend every penny in the local economy. And that's what's the driver. If we're going to try and introduce stimulus to the economy, to encourage growth, surely that's one of the better ways of doing it, to pump money into the welfare system, which can then flow into the wider economy. And indeed, even Stephen Crabb admitted that as minister for this issue a few years ago, 2015, when this change was brought in, the welfare cap was originally designed, it was engineered to drive down the value of social security over time. So you recognise even from its starting position, it was already engineered to be inadequate. And the uplift was actually a way of correcting a historical error. So why would you then rip it back out again? It's just, at every level, it makes no sense to me.
Oliver Mundell makes no sense, according to your critics there, both Clare and Paul.
Yeah, no, and I hear what they've got to say, and I know that families right across the country are hard pressed. But as you said in the opening, this was designed to be a temporary measure there at the height of the pandemic, and I think we do have to consider whether it's manageable in the long term, and that's always about balancing things out. Where Clare mentioned the fact that taxes are going up. We've taken on an additional £400 billion worth of debt during the pandemic. This measure, if made permanent, would cost an extra £6 billion a year, and neither of these other parties will tell us where they want to find the money for that. And I think we have to think about what's fair to everyone, in the tax and welfare balance. And I think that we're at a point where certainly the labour market's strengthening. There are early signs that the economy is starting to recover, and I think we're through, in terms of not necessarily in terms of the health, but hopefully we're through the kind of financial, sort of crunch of the pandemic, and hopefully we'll continue to see things improve.
If I may say, I'll bring the others in a second, and I will put that point to them about where they would find that funding. But if I may say so, Oliver, you don't sound exactly enthusiastic defending this move. Would you prefer it to have been deferred at the very least?
I wouldn't have preferred it to be deferred. No, I think this is the right time. In an ideal world, Brian, I would have liked it to continue indefinitely. I would like there to be more support out there for everyone. But I'm not hiding from it. I think this is the right decision. I fully support the UK government in going ahead with it. And when I go back and speak to constituents in Dumfriesshire, I think most people recognise that there is a need to balance, balance the kind of long-term financial issues and how much support we can provide through the welfare system.
Thanks,
so I'm positive that the decision's been made now, and I think it is the right time.
Clare Adamson, what about that point? You need to balance the requirements of those who are taxpayers, those who are national insurance payers, those who are in work, those who are on pensions. You have to. It is a question of balance. Clare.
Sorry, it was breaking up there, Brian. I didn't hear the question.
It's a question of balance. You have to balance the needs of those who are requiring welfare support, those who are in work, those who are paying tax. It is a question of balance, and this strikes the right balance.
No, it's a question of choice. Politics is all about choice and where you use your money and where you raise your money. And this has been all wrong. Brexit has had a terrible effect on the country. And far from seeing, all the millions of pounds that were to come to the NHS on the side of a bus, they're now raising taxes to fund social care and health. This has been handled so badly by the UK government. And we just need to look at the money squandered on PPE contracts that were dished out, and the waste of money at the top. And at the end of the day, they're making the poorest and most vulnerable people in our society pay for this. It's a matter of choice, not a matter of balance.
I'll bring in Oliver in a minute. You were keen to come back in, but Paul Sweeney, what's your take on this? Where would you find, Oliver Mundell challenges you and Claire, where would you find the estimated £6 billion cost of this project going forward?
We're back to the old fallacy of the household budget is the same as the national economy, and I'm afraid this doesn't work like that. You're actually in a vicious cycle by ripping like hundreds of, if not billions of pounds out of the economy. You're actually going to drive down tax revenues. You're actually going to militate against the very thing you're trying to sort out. So actually by putting money in to people who are always going to spend it, the marginal propensity of consumers always higher amongst poorer income households, you're actually going to reinforce tax revenues. So that's actually a fallacious argument, in my opinion, from an economic point of view. But also, let's look at the incidence. I agree, taxes will have to rise, but where is it falling on the population? We've actually seen the Conservatives introduce a tax that will disproportionately fall on those who are working families that are already trying to struggle to meet ends meet, whilst billionaires, people who are earning their money from asset wealth, are actually getting a tax cut in effect. The level of income from billionaires and multi-millionaires as a share of the overall national economy is massively increased over the pandemic, whilst people who are reliant on waged income and salaried income have seen their share of the national wealth squeezed, and wages have stagnated for over a decade now. And that's why so many people are actually relying on universal credit to top up.
You're saying that's deliberate choice rather than accidental.
Absolutely. The Conservatives have obviously got they're effectively people who donate to the Conservative Party are buying shares and developing public policy, and they're not going to do it in favour of people who are in a weak position in society. That's why fundamentally you have to go back to the choice about whose actions and whose interests are government figures acting in. And the Conservative Party, I'm afraid, always will act in the interest of their money donors, and that's just simply another permutation of how they do business in this country. And that's why obviously I am agitating for a Labour government at the earliest opportunity.
Oliver Mundell.
Yeah, I was going to say, despite all of that, Brian, there's no sign from the polls that people in Scotland or across the UK are joining Paul in agitating for that Labour government. And despite the difficult choices the Conservatives are taking to increase tax revenue, people by and large understand why that needs to be done. And I think that most people will look at the balance of these decisions and think that this is the right time to end what was a temporary payment designed to support families during the toughest part of the pandemic. And I think that people will have heard both those answers and not really heard any specifics on how we've to raise an extra £6 billion. It's all sort of circular sort of arguments and kind of broad brush, but there's no practical suggestions on how we would raise £6 billion.
Well, we did hear Paul saying it taking millions, indeed possibly billions, out of the economy through removing money from those who are on low incomes, who by definition of having a relatively tight budget tend to spend that if they have additional cash. That in itself will undermine and cripple the economy. I don't
think it will cripple the economy. It may have. There will be an effect on spending, but I don't think. When the analysis is done, and I don't have that to hand, but when the analysis is done, I think that there's more borrowing involved in continuing to make that payment than there would be in tax revenue gathered on the spending.
Let's go.
Win it through growth and inflation.
Hold on a second, Paul. Let's go. I'll bring it back in a second. Oliver, let's go from the general to the particular. Do you accept removing this uprating of £20 will cause hardship to individuals and to families around Scotland?
I think it's accepting that even with this £20 payment, Brian, there are individuals and families in hardship in Scotland. I don't think it's I don't think the £20 in itself is the cure-all that it's sometimes presented as. I do accept.
It'll make it worse.
I do accept that there'll be people who will be in hardship. Yes. But there are people in hardship right now. There are families who are not eligible for universal credit at all, who are in hardship. And I think the best way to tackle that in the long term it is to see wages go up, to see a strengthening labour market, and people to be supported into high-skilled, high-paid employment.
Almost out of time. Final comments, Paul Sweeney and then Clare Adamson. Paul Sweeney first.
For all that,
Hang on, Clare. Paul first, then Clare.
Well, I just think it's an interesting insight to two alternative visions. One of another miserable decade of cutting, austerity, and a race to the bottom, whilst the people at the top of society get ever richer on their asset wealth. Or we can have an alternative vision where we share the recovery together by actually redistributing. I mean, we talked about the practicalities. Let's actually go for growth. Let's look at how we can invest in the economy. We need to push that money into the economy as we move out of the pandemic and actually get things motoring again. The best way to do that is to use people to spend their money in the economy, and we can also take all that accumulated wealth from the highest income households in the country who will never spend it. I mean, goodness me, £1 billion, it take 1,000 years at £1 million a year to earn that kind of money. It's just crazy amounts of money. We could actually harvest that surplus and use that to reinforce the public finances, as stamp duty, any number of different taxes on wealth, which have barely changed in 30, 40 years. We've focused so much on taxing income, not taxing wealth. That's got to be a fundamental reorientation of our economic tax base. That would be the key to doing it.
Right time, Clare Adamson, I promise you a final word on this.
Well, I just think it's. I'm listening to Oliver, and most of the levers around this are at Westminster. And if we just looked at the Fair Work agenda in itself, a real living wage for people, an end to 0 hours contracts and exploitative employment practices, and business actually taking more of a civic responsibility in looking after the staff. And as Paul said, that would all help the economy in the long run, but it also would protect the most vulnerable people in our country. And Oliver, maybe would lift the phone to his friends in Westminster and ask them to do something about that.
I'll go in very quickly.
Very, very brief.
I'd say, Clare, I'd take that a lot more seriously. If your government practiced what it preached, it still counts positive destinations as a successful outcome. 0 hours contracts as a positive destination for young people. And it doesn't use all of the powers it's got to do these things. It tries at every turn to hide behind Westminster, and people can see that for themselves.
Thanks very much, all. Thanks to my 3 MSPs. Thank you. Thanks to the 3 MSPs. Terrific discussion. Thanks to Alistair Grant for contributing and keeping us up to speed, and to all of those at home watching this or whatever method or platform. I'm told I have to say, thank you very much indeed. Remember that you can subscribe to the Herald through that little thing. What's it? Herald Pod 2021. From me, Brian Taylor. Toodaloo.